So, Willie, in the middle of the first block, you may have heard a little bit of Miles Davis, a note or two of Miles Davis has my ringtone. Yeah, we all noted that. That was Ari Emanuel. This is very disturbing. Ari knows.
Why does he keep
we have this show?
I know.
From 6 to 9. He just calls in the middle of the show.
It's rude.
All the more disturbing, it's like 3:10 out there. He's working out at 3 in the morning. And in the middle of his workouts, he's calling us up. But this was his great insight, that this was just like the old killer bees scare. Remember, they kept telling us that the killer bees were coming from Southern and Central America, and they were going to all eat us alive.
Yeah.
It never came to fruition. But I tell you what, there were the killer bats last night, the Red Sox. How about that segue? Red Sox, did you see any of the game last night?
I did.
Good.
I stayed up until 5-4, I think, and then former Yankee great Eduardo Nunez put it away with a 3-run home run, pinch hit 3-run home run. One of the all-time great Yankees, and we're happy to loan him to you for your World Series efforts.
Yeah, well, that's very nice of you. It all goes back to the Yankees.
Joe, the other analogy, the killer bees analogy, would be the Y2K. Remember the great threat that was going to come and wipe out civilization? The Caravan is sort of the Y2K of 2018.
Very scared about that. Now, last night I saw that the first part of the World Series, you're already out and about. You were at an Alzheimer's event last night.
Yeah, I was. I was emceeing the Alzheimer's Association event here in New York City. As you know well, Joe, there are 6 million people in this country who live with that. It's a devastating disease, not only to the person who has it, but to the family who cares for them. So I'm always happy to lend a small voice in a night or two and to help them raise some money for that.
Yeah, it's so important. Of course, the news yesterday of Sandra Day O'Connor.
Yep.
Knowing this was, Evan Thomas wrote, this was her biggest fear, that her mother had it. Her husband, of course, had it. She got off the court to take care of him. Her sister had it. There's a lot of research that needs to be done still. We have a long way to go in that battle. It does impact families.
Yeah, and Sandra Day O'Connor spent she left the court in 2005 to be with her husband who had Alzheimer's. He died of Alzheimer's, but she fought that entire time until now. She says she's going to step out of public life, but she's been fighting for a dozen years now to get funding, and it has worked. It was brought up last night. David Hyde Pierce was one of the guests there, and his father died of it, and he's been lobbying Congress for years. He says, I remember the first time I went up, we were asking for $1 million. We got it. And he said this year the funding for Alzheimer's from the federal government will be $2.3 billion. So there is progress being made there, Joe.
Real progress.
So let's talk some politics. We've got Steve Kornacki at the table, Georgia's Secretary of State Brian Kemp, the state's top election official, who's also the Republican nominee for governor, has been accused of voter suppression for putting the registrations of more than 53,000 voters on hold with his office, nearly 70% of them black, in a state where African Americans make up only 32% of the population. And now Rolling Stone has published audio of Kemp at a private event expressing concern for his chances if, quote, everybody uses and exercises their right to vote.
And as worried as we were going into the start of early voting with the literally tens of millions of dollars that they are putting behind to get out the vote efforts for their base, a lot of that with absentee ballot requests. They have just an unprecedented number of that, which is something that continues to concern us, especially if everybody uses and exercises their right to vote, which they absolutely can, and mails those ballots in. We got to have heavy turnout to offset that.
Continues to concern us if everyone uses and exercises their right to vote. A spokesperson for Kemp did not directly respond to questions about that recording. This, as another poll shows Kemp tied with Democratic nominee Stacey Abrams, 48 to 48. In a debate last night, Kemp said he will not recuse himself if the race goes to a recount.
Do you believe you can impartially oversee the state's elections while also running for governor? And two, your office is required by law to direct a recount. Would you recuse yourself if a recount is necessary?
And I appreciate that question. I took an oath of office to serve as Secretary of State, and that's exactly what I'm going to continue to do.
under Secretary Kemp, more people have lost the right to vote in the state of Georgia. They've been purged, they've been suppressed, and they've been scared. This is a man who had someone arrested for helping her blind father cast a ballot. He raided the offices of organizations to stop them from registering voters. That type of voter suppression feeds the narrative, because voter suppression isn't only about blocking the vote. It's also about creating an atmosphere of fear, making people worry that their votes won't count.
As I said, national political correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC, Steve Kornacki, joins us now, along with the New York Times reporter, Jeremy Peters. Guys, good morning. Steve, how can Kemp not recuse himself if this goes to a recount?
I mean, the argument he'll make is that the recount is not, there's a sort of an automatic trigger for a recount. If that happens, the Secretary of State's office, he would say, and we saw Chris Kobach try to make this case early on in Kansas during the primary, the Secretary of State's office maybe not as involved in that. It's more of a local matter in terms of recounting them. He tried to make that case, but obviously this issue is now just sort of overtaking this race. The other thing, though, that comes to mind when you put that poll up on the screen, 48-48, the other thing to keep in mind is that Georgia is sort of unique among states in that they've got this general election between a Democratic nominee and a Republican nominee, but they also have a runoff provision in Georgia. And there is a Libertarian candidate who was at that debate last night. And this has happened a couple times in the last generation in Georgia. If that Libertarian candidate gets 3-4% of the vote, and this race is as even as these polls are showing, and no one gets 50%, this thing heads to a runoff. In the modern history of runoffs in Georgia, and this would be tested this year, I think, but the modern history of runoffs in Georgia is that there's sort of a surge Democratic participation in the November general election has dropped off. And Republicans have done well in these runoff elections. There was a famous one right after the 1992 election. Bill Clinton carried the state of Georgia, defeated George H.W. Bush. The Senate race went to a runoff. The Republican won the Senate race. Barack Obama got within 5 points in 2008 in Georgia. The Senate race went to a runoff. The Senate race then went to the Republican by a lopsided double-digit margin. So the Democrats have been sort of keying all of their efforts to this general election in November. The Stacey Abrams formula here in particular is to try to expand the electorate, get that surge turnout. But if this thing kicks over to a runoff, Democrats then need to try to replicate that a few weeks later.
This is what makes Kemp so dangerous, right? I mean, most folks will say he's like the Uber version of the guy who tries to suppress the vote. That is to say, he is deploying almost all the methods at once, as opposed to individual methods, whether it's voter ID laws, whether it's cross-check, a range of things. How can he, in some ways, make the argument that he should shall we say, preside over this election, given that kind of shadow? I mean, it would seem to cast a shadow of illegitimacy, even if he wins.
Well, that's the question, I think. First of all, politically, what effect is this going to have in the home stretch of the campaign? Is this going to take any sort of undecided or swing voters in the state and move them against him? Is this going to have the effect of further motivating the Democratic base, voters that Stacey Abrams is trying to get out to the polls? Is this going to have the effect, as Stacey Abrams said in that clip you just played? I think what Democrats are worried about here, too, because keep in mind that number 53,000, those folks can show up at the polls if they provide an ID and can resolve whatever the impasse is. They can then cast a ballot. But the question that Democrats are raising is, okay, but is this going to have the effect of sort of making those voters think, I'm not supposed to, I shouldn't, it's better if I don't? Does it have that kind of effect, too?
Joe?
Well, Jeremy Peters, though, it's just, I mean, we all learn to get cynical about things like this, but even in these cynical days, it's staggering to hear a Secretary of State who's in charge of voting getting caught on an open mic saying we're in big trouble if people go out and exercise their right to vote. That, I must admit, that's a new one in terms of just pure, sheer cynicism coming from the person who's in charge of voting for a state.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we all know that there is this veneer that a lot of Republicans like to put over this debate, that this is all about election integrity and the need to ensure that there isn't fraudulent voting occurring, even though fraudulent voting itself is basically a fraudulent myth. So what you have going on here is a very Trumpian argument, right? It's if the other side is fired up and voting the system must be rigged. They're cheating, and they are denying us our rightful victory here. And I think it's a struggle that you've seen across the country, from North Carolina to Pennsylvania, where you've had these state legislatures enact these voting rights laws, gerrymandered districts in extreme fashions in a way to preserve a majority when they are in fact slipping closer and closer to minority status. So I'm actually surprised it hasn't gotten worse than this.
And Brian Kemp at the debate last night called voter suppression a farce in the state of Georgia, said it's absolutely not true that it's taking place. Everybody sit tight. We're going to come right back with the latest numbers on some of the other key races. We'll be back in just a moment.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.